A ledger crumbles in the hands of a surveyor, its pages whispering 23 names marked by the same number 21. What covenant waits in the ink the color of faded sky? The road to Walnut Hill was little more than a scar of wagon ruts pressed into clay, hemmed in on both sides by pines that whispered even when the air was still. The surveyor had been sent there to measure boundaries no one had thought about in years, to confirm where one man's acreage ended and another's began. He carried with him the habits of his trade, a brass compass polished bright, a notebook with squared lines, and a restless curiosity that often led him to places not listed on his instructions. That curiosity drew him off the main track one gray afternoon when the roofline of a church appeared through the trees. It was not a church that welcomed the weary. Its steeple leaned, half swallowed by vines, and the doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. Shingles clung like dead scales, the bell missing from its tower. Yet there was a silence about it more profound than the hush of abandonment, as if even birds preferred not to light upon its rafters. The surveyor tethered his mule and stepped inside, boots stirring a century's worth of dust. The pews lay in collapse, timbers warped by damp, but at the far end near the pulpit, an iron-bound chest sat tilted against the wall. Its lid had already split, inviting him closer. Within, beneath a mildew-stained altar cloth, lay a ledger thick as a family Bible, its leather weather cracked and flaking at the edges. He opened it with the care of a man lifting bones. The handwriting within was neat, each line ruled with a practiced hand. Names marched down the pages: Thornwood, 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 23 in all, each followed by a date and the same chilling notation: age 21, turning. No explanation, no scripture, only that stark phrase, written in the same ink, as though copied by ritual. The surveyor ran his finger along the margins, where smudges of faded blue stained the parchment. Ink should darken to brown with age. This color had not. Later examination would label this Exhibit A, a brittle baptism roll tucked into the back cover, its columns marked with the births and blessings of the Thornwood children. The roll bore the same uncanny blemishes, spots of indigo that had soaked deep into the fibers, as though the quill itself bled a mineral pigment unknown to ordinary wells. Voiceover lingers on these details, careful, almost reverent. 23 names. 23 notations of a coming change at 21. Local rumor says the Thornwoods bled blue beneath their skin, that their veins darkened with something drawn from the mountain itself. The ledger, cracked and fragile, is more than paper. It is a witness, silent and exacting, to a family whose secret could not be buried beneath dust, vines, or time. The voice of Reverend Obadiah Hale comes thin through the recording, like a man pressing words past a throat grown dry with age and memory. He does not sit still while he speaks. The chair creaks under his restless shifting, his hands twitching at the hem of his coat as though to shake off something that clings. He admits at once that he has no wish to revisit the Thornwood homestead in word or in thought, yet he cannot refuse when pressed. If truth is to be told, he murmurs, let it be told with trembling, for trembling is what I still feel. He recalls the ordinary rites first, as though to soften the ground before he digs deeper. Weddings beneath the oak on the ridge, the bride crowned with laurel and mountain roses, the groom tall and solemn, Thornwoods all. He says they sang the same hymn each time, the one not in the official book but scribbled into the margins of their family copy, nearer to the work of our hands. He recalls funerals, too. Quiet affairs held at dusk, coffins lowered into earth already damp with spring melt. Never did he hear a widow wail or a mother collapse in grief. Instead, the Thornwoods stood as if rehearsed, their faces pale, their voices low, promising something he never quite caught, words too quick, whispered in unison as the last shovelfuls of dirt fell. But what unsettled him most, what still keeps his sleep broken after so many years, were the gatherings he came to call the midnight pledges. He had been summoned twice, under pretense of blessing a newborn, and once again to offer prayer over a sickness that swept the house. Both times he found the family gathered not in their chapel's pews but in a circle on the stone floor, lanterns doused, the air thick with smoke of herbs that burned bitter on the tongue. At the center lay a copper basin filled with water so dark it reflected nothing. Each Thornwood, one after another, pricked the tip of a finger and let a drop fall, whispering words Hale swears were not of English, nor of any tongue he knew from Scripture. The drop spread across the surface, not red, but with a glimmer he likens to moonlight pressed into liquid. Among Hale's worn Bible pages are marginal notes, ink blotted where his hand shook. In the Gospel of John, he has circled the verse about water turned to wine, the ink strangely tinted, as if something stained his quill. In Leviticus, the commandment against strange fire is underlined twice, the word blue scrawled beside it. When asked if he will return to the chapel where he once preached, he shakes his head so violently the lantern on the table rattles. "That place is no house of God," he whispers. The floor remembers, the walls remember, and I dare not. The sworn words of Silas Morton, a traveling peddler of combs, ribbons, and patent remedies, survive in the courthouse archive with edges browned and corners curling like old bark. His affidavit begins in plain fashion, giving his route and the date, June of 1856, on Ridge Road where the mountain air grows heavy even in morning. He tells how he came upon a girl in a calico dress, bonnet dangling by its string, trudging barefoot as if in great haste. He swore later that she bore the Thornwood look tall, pale, eyes dark as slate. When she saw him, she startled like a deer and stumbled. The road was rough with gravel and ruts. She fell hard, striking her head against a stone. Morton writes that he leapt down from his wagon to assist, expecting blood the way a man expects breath. But what he saw, he said, robbed me of reason and fixed me like a man turned to pillar. From the girl's scalp welled not the familiar crimson, but a fluid, bright as the feather of a jay, shining against the dust. He describes cupping her head, the liquid staining his palm, leaving streaks that shimmered in sunlight with an iridescent hue. She stirred, gasped, and clutched her bonnet, and in the next instant pushed him away with surprising force. "You saw nothing," she told him, voice hoarse, before vanishing up the ridge path, her hand pressed against the wound, leaving not a drop upon the dirt behind her. Morton insists he tried to wash his hands in the creek that evening, but the stain lingered for days, fading only after his skin blistered in Sunday. He carried the story to the nearest magistrate, presenting it with trembling hands. "It is truth," he wrote, "though I wish it were false, for no man is believed when he speaks of blue blood." The constable's rebuttal, Exhibit B, is clipped and dismissive, penned with the dry authority of a man weary of country tales. "Mr. Morton," it reads, "was observed in an intemperate state more than once during his stay. His account of colored blood is without merit, the effect of heat and drink upon a susceptible imagination. Locals of sound repute saw no such event. The Thornwood family is respectable, if peculiar, and not to be slandered by itinerants seeking attention." Yet between the lines of this official denial, one senses unease. The constable underlines respectable with a heavier stroke than the rest of his script, as though trying to persuade himself as much as any reader. Morton's affidavit, shaky and fervent, survived because he would not withdraw it. He pressed his hand upon the Bible, swore again that he had seen a girl's blood gleam blue, brighter than any dye or sky, and declared he would rather be thought drunk 100 times over than he once about what his eyes beheld. The man who called himself Dr. Silas Cutter never held a diploma from any medical college, though he carried himself with the certainty of one who believed knowledge lay more in soil and stone than in books. He drifted through the Appalachian valleys with a wagon heavy with powders, tinctures, and curious rocks wrapped in cloth, claiming cures drawn from the mineral heart of the earth. Most dismissed him as another charlatan, a hawker of salts and snake oils, yet his eyes carried a brightness, and his notebooks filled with sketches so precise that even men of science later remarked on them. It was Cutter who spoke most plainly about the Thornwoods and what coursed beneath their land. He insisted the mountain was no ordinary rise of shale and timber, but a body in its own right, threaded with veins of cobalt and washings of silver, glittering lodes that pulsed faintly when struck with hammer and chisel. "Look at it," he would tell those willing to linger at his campfire. "Like the very arteries of a buried giant, blue metal and quicksilver running together. And where folk drink the water that seeps from such seams, where they till the ground heavy with that ore, mark me, their blood is not their own." He would draw quick strokes on scraps of paper, lines branching and curling like the diagrams in medical texts, only his arteries were tunnels of mineral. His heart a cavern deep beneath the Thornwood ridge. Cutter claimed to have tapped one of these veins himself, a thin ribbon of stone that shimmered with a hue he swore could not be described by any painter's palette. He held up a sliver of it once before a gathered crowd in a tavern, the shard catching lamplight with an uncanny luster. Some swore it was no earthly substance, others only shook their heads, muttering of trickery. Cutter merely smiled and said, "What you call trick, I call truth. The mountain feeds its own, and the Thornwoods are its chosen vessels." His notes, preserved in water-stained journals, contain a field sketch of remarkable detail, a cross-section of Walnut Hill where he had dug shallow shafts, veins of ore traced in ink of faded blue, curling and twisting with the deliberate pattern of a circulatory system. Beneath the homestead he drew the thickest lode of all, a branching root of cobalt that spread beneath field, spring, and chapel alike. He marked it with a single phrase, "The deep vein, source of the turning." Cutter's voice, when captured in second-hand accounts, trembled not with fear but with awe. "Blue blood," he said, "is not of man, nor of any natural sickness. It is the earth itself, risen into flesh, claiming what is nearest. And those born on Thornwood soil cannot escape it, no more than a child can escape the beating of his own heart." The film of the Thornwood Bible begins with the creak of its binding, leather warped and swollen from damp brass clasps greened with age. Each page turns slowly beneath gloved hands, the paper feathering at the edges like brittle moth wings. The names entered upon those pages carry the long rhythm of kinship: Josiah, Temperance, Obed, Moriah, lines upon lines of Thornwoods stretching back to the first settlers who carved a homestead out of the ridge. Beside each name lies the familiar tally of dates, birth, baptism, marriage, death. Yet there is another mark, one not found in any church register. The number 21, written with a deliberate underline that crumbles to powder when touched. The residue clings to the gloves, faint but visible in the light, a smear the color of faded indigo. The archivist pauses, rubbing two fingers together, remarking on the way it smudges like chalk, but leaves a faint shimmer, as if something metallic has been ground into dust. The camera lingers as page after page repeats the pattern. 21 years circled, underscored, emphasized as though nothing mattered before or after. Birth may begin the line, marriage may extend it, but the 21st year stands alone, the true threshold. Voiceover intrudes with questions that hover more than answer. Is it a rite, a family custom preserved in script and smudge, or is it notation of a sickness, a hereditary affliction that revealed itself precisely when youth ended and adulthood began? Did the Thornwoods record it in reverence or in fear? Folded between two pages lies a square of linen, yellowed with age, its edges stitched to prevent fray. In its center is a prick mark, the faint rust-colored stain one might expect from a drop of blood. Yet beside it, penned in the cramped hand of an earlier generation, is the note, "Tested no rust." The words seem simple until considered carefully. If blood leaves no rust, if it does not darken to iron brown, then what flowed here was something else. The stain itself is not brown, but grayish, touched with a blue haze that appears only when the cloth is tilted against the light. The film continues through the Bible until the last entry, a child born in 1855, her line awaiting the mark that will one day be added. The camera lingers on that blank space, the margin unsullied, a breath held between pages. Then it returns to the repeated figures 21, underlined, dusted with blue, and the voiceover fades to silence, leaving only the faint rasp of paper against paper, as though the book itself were breathing. The recording opens with the scrape of a chair and the low shuffle of skirts against a wooden floor. Widow Temperance Thornwood sits at her kitchen table, the light through the single window falling across her face in a way that deepens the lines at her temples but never quite reveals her eyes. She keeps her hands folded inside her sleeves, as though the very sight of her skin might give away more than she intends. The air is still, yet her breath fogs as she speaks, each word leaving a faint cloud, visible proof that the room holds a chill no midsummer sun can dispel. She begins without prompting, her voice steady but soft, the cadence of someone used to prayer spoken in half whispers. They call it a curse, she says, but they are wrong. It is a blessing of the deep. The mountain gives what it takes, and takes what it gives. We are its keepers. When asked to explain what she means, she shakes her head, lips curling in a faint smile. To explain is to lessen. You cannot name the color of the sky and expect it to remain unchanged. Some things are only carried, not spoken. On the stove behind her, a kettle sits blackened from years of use. The microphone notes a faint hiss, as though water is ready to boil, but the lid never trembles, no steam rises. Minutes pass, and the kettle remains the same, sound without progress. The interview log later underlines this moment. Audio note kettle never boils. Possible interference or phenomenon. Temperance recounts weddings, funerals, births, but always circles back to the number 21. That is when the breath deepens, she says, her words threading with a strange reverence. When the pulse slows, and the veins find their true hue. My mother called it the age of choosing. You either carry the blue with grace or let it hollow you. Some do not last. Some shine brighter for it. She leans forward then, the fog of her breath drifting across the table, and the interviewer notes that the temperature drops several degrees, though no window stands open. Pressed for her own age, Temperance laughs softly, a dry, rustling sound like wind through pine needles. Age is for those who rust. We do not rust. She gestures toward the cupboard, where jars of preserved fruit glow dark and heavy in the dim light. Their glass is tinged faintly blue, as though something leached into them from within. We keep what is ours, she says. The deep keeps the rest. When the tape ends, the kettle still hisses, it never boiled. The descent to the spring is marked first by sound. The floorboards of the old smokehouse groan underfoot, then give way to a hollow resonance as the crew moves toward the trapdoor at the back wall. Each step echoes as though the earth itself were a chamber waiting to be entered. When the door is pried open, a breath of damp air rises, cool and mineral-scented, carrying with it the faint tang of stone dust and wet iron. A rope ladder creaks as the first man climbs down, his lantern throwing arcs of light across limestone walls veined with dark seams that glisten like wet marrow. At the bottom lies the spring, a pool no wider than 10 feet, encircled by rock worn smooth as bone. The water at first appears clear, perfectly still, reflecting the lantern flame with glass-like calm. But when one of the crew kneels and dips a stick across its surface, the liquid shivers and flashes a startling cerulean, a bloom of blue that spreads outward in concentric circles before fading back to transparency. The camera lingers on this phenomenon, a momentary illumination, as if the pool revealed its secret for an instant and then sealed it away again. Field notes capture the unease of the moment. Livestock do not drink here, one observer writes. Goats tethered nearby strain against their leads, eyes rolling white, bleeding until removed to safer ground. Horses refuse to be led down the slope at all. On the bank, caught in the glow of the lantern, lies a jay, feathers still bright but body rigid, eyes clouded with a film like frost over glass. The lens moves closer, and the film captures the unsettling way the bird's eye reflects the light, not the dull gleam of death, but a strange, shimmering haze, as if something else lingered there. The crew lowers a tin cup into the water, pulling it up carefully. In the dim light, the liquid appears ordinary, yet when poured onto the limestone, it leaves behind a faint blue stain that takes several minutes to fade. One member presses a damp finger to his lips before the others can stop him. He spits instantly, retching, claiming a taste of copper and something sweet, like sugar scorched black. His tongue, the notes later remark, bore a pale blue tint for the remainder of the night. The recording closes with the camera fixed on the pool, its surface calm again, no trace of the earlier bloom. But the audio captures something faint, a distant tapping, like stone struck deep below. 3 knocks, then silence, as though the spring were answering in its own buried language. The story of Josiah Thornwood's 21st night has come down in fragments, whispered from elder to child, then written into ledgers with the same careful hand that marked births and deaths. The reconstruction begins with the house sealed tight against the dark, shutters drawn, doors barred, even the hearth covered with a copper plate. No outsider was permitted to witness, though the neighbors claimed to hear faint voices rising like smoke into the mountain air. Josiah, eldest son of Obed and Mercy Thornwood, had spent the day in a curious quiet, neither working the fields nor breaking bread with the others. He was kept apart, fasting, drinking only from the spring behind the ridge. At dusk he was led into the parlor, where a copper basin had been set upon a low table. Water from the spring filled it, black in the lamplight, surface as smooth as oil. The family gathered around him, each holding a slip of paper torn from a hymn book. The chosen song, as every Thornwood after him would repeat, was, "Nearer to the work of our hands." The surviving sheet lies now in a trunk, its margin scarred by the long groove of a fingernail dragged down the paper, as if someone tried to anchor the words into flesh. They sang in low tones, voices blending with a hum too deep to be entirely human. When the hymn was finished, Josiah was told to place both hands in the basin. Accounts say he flinched, for the water was colder than ice, colder than the deepest winter creek, though the night outside was warm with June air. His mother whispered a prayer none of the younger children were allowed to repeat, a prayer that ended with the extinguishing of every lamp in the room. For several minutes, the house was silent except for breathing and the faint dripping of condensation from the copper basin onto the floorboards. At dawn, Josiah emerged. His brothers remembered him pale, eyes wide as though he had not slept. He took up a razor to shave the beginnings of a beard that had come with his new manhood. When the blade slipped and nicked his jaw, those watching swore they saw no red. Instead, a thin line opened, and what welled out gleamed like morning sky, a liquid shimmer that caught the light in a way no ordinary blood could. He wiped it with his sleeve, and the cloth carried the stain of blue long after the wound had closed. From that day, the Thornwoods marked 21 not as an age but as a passage, the moment when flesh revealed its hidden covenant with the mountain. And Josiah, first to turn, walked into history with the hue of heaven running beneath his skin. The letters of Eliza Thornwood, written in the summer of her 21st year, survive only because her sister in Lexington stored them in a cedar chest, wrapped in cloth scented with lavender. Time has browned their edges and blurred some of the strokes, but much remains clear, the lines slanting forward as though her hand could not keep pace with what pressed upon her. Each envelope bears a seal of black wax, stamped with the Thornwood crest, a root twining itself around an anvil, the impression so deep it can still be felt beneath the fingertips. The first letter begins with the usual pleasantries, yet the words soon veer toward the strange. Eliza writes of her hands trembling at the needlework frame, of pricking her finger and finding the blood sluggish, reluctant, as though it had thickened. "It leaves not red but a shadow of dusk upon the cloth," she notes, and confesses to a taste of pennies that lingers on her tongue even when she has eaten nothing metallic. She pleads with her sister not to think her fanciful, swearing she has prayed earnestly for the sensation to pass. In the second letter, The script grows more erratic. She writes of waking in the night with her arms alight, as though tiny sparks coursed beneath the skin. Fireflies in the veins, she calls them, marveling and fearing in the same breath. She says her mother urged calm, reminding her that all Thornwoods come to this passage. The words, "this passage," are underlined twice, the ink smudged where her hand pressed too quickly. She admits to pressing her palms against the stone hearth until they ached, hoping the chill might quiet the restless glow within. But the light only danced brighter, she confides, and I thought for a moment I could see it shimmer through the skin, as though my body were but a lantern. The third letter is shorter, the handwriting smaller, squeezed into the page margins. She writes of numb fingertips, of lips gone pale and tinged with blue at their edges. She says she has ceased to fear it, that a calm has come upon her like deep water. I feel as though I belong to something vast and ancient, she tells her sister. And if it asks for me, I shall not resist. The closing line chills more than any other. When you next see me, do not look for the girl you knew. Look instead for the vessel I have become. The black wax still clings, stubborn against the parchment, as though to bind her words shut. Yet once read, the letters cannot be forgotten. They speak not merely of illness or imagination, but of transformation, of a heritage rooted as deep as the mountain itself, drawing Eliza into the same covenant that claimed Josiah before her and would claim every Thornwood after. Sheriff Abram Pike worked by lamplight, the room close with the smell of tobacco and rain-soaked leather. Spread across the table before him was the county map, its paper already creased from years of folding and refolding, edges fraying like an oft-read Bible. He had marked it many times in the course of his duty stolen livestock here, a feud resolved there, but this night his pins were of a different sort. They glinted blue in the lamplight, each one pressed into the map at a place where the Thornwoods had bound themselves in marriage. The pattern was not one of happenstance. Pike had traced it carefully, starting with Josiah's union and moving forward through the decades. Always the homesteads near water, near the shaded bends of creek beds where the shale glistened with its strange seams. The pins bloomed like a rash along those streams, clustering around Walnut Hill as though the earth itself conspired to draw them closer. He sat back, rubbing his temples, muttering to the empty room about jurisdiction of the unseen. He was a man sworn to uphold law. Yet what law could be pressed upon a family whose covenant seemed to lie not with man, but with the hidden veins of the mountain? On the table beside the map lay a folded sheet, its ink dark and deliberate, every letter carved with the weight of decision. At the top it bore the heading, Warrant of Investigation, beneath, the charge, Unknown Practice at Thornwood Place. It named no crime the statutes could recognize. Only the suspicion of rites held at night, of alterations to the body unnatural and unaccounted for. Pike had signed his name at the bottom but never dated it, and the seal remained absent. Exhibit C, as archivists would later call it, was both an act of courage and hesitation, a document that spoke of his conviction and his fear in equal measure. As he studied the map, thunder rolled across the ridge, and for a moment the lamplight flickered. Pike pressed his hand flat against the paper as though to steady not just the map but the ground beneath it. He whispered that the county lines meant little here, that the Thornwoods answered to another boundary, one older than any deed or survey. He thought of the peddler's testimony, the reverend's trembling words, the whispers of blue fire in the veins. The pins stared back at him like watchful eyes, each one a reminder that the family's reach spread through blood and water alike. The warrant remained unsent, folded once and tucked beneath the map. Perhaps Pike feared ridicule, perhaps retribution, or perhaps he understood too well that to accuse the Thornwoods formally would be to step beyond the law's comfort into a darkness no statute could govern. The map bore silent witness to his unease, the blue pins marking not just places but an inheritance rooted in stone and stream, a pattern that seemed less like genealogy and more like design. The testimony comes in fragments, offered by neighbors who rarely spoke of such things in daylight. They tell of nights when the air along the ridge grew too still, when even the insects hushed and the dogs would not bark. Those who dared to look from their windows swore they saw figures dressed in white moving in slow procession between the Thornwood house and the spring that fed from the limestone hollow. Lanterns were carried low, their light muted by cloth, so that the shapes seemed to glow faintly against the dark. Each figure bore a copper bowl in both hands, held at chest height with a reverence that looked more ritual than labor. One farmer, reluctant even under oath, admitted he counted at least a dozen such figures, their garments trailing in the dew, their feet bare despite the cold. He said he thought at first they were carrying water, but the way the bowls caught the moonlight unsettled him. Not water, he muttered. Something heavier. Something that gleamed when it moved. His wife claimed she saw the procession halt at the spring, each bowl lowered in turn. And though she could not hear their words, the cadence of murmured voices carried across the pasture. She remembered the sound of metal striking stone 3 times before the line began its slow return to the house. The camera in the present lingers on what remains in the Thornwood smokehouse, a place long abandoned but still rank with the odor of charred wood and damp earth. Against one wall, stacked neatly despite the dust of decades, lie copper bowls, their rims dulled, but their interiors marked with stains no scrubbing could erase. Instead of the expected green patina of age, the insides are washed with streaks of deep azure, as though something had seeped into the very metal and altered its nature. Experts remark in voiceover that copper does not hold such color. It corrodes to green, not blue. Whatever touched these bowls left a trace unknown to any ordinary chemistry. In dramatization, the procession is recreated, white figures moving silently through the night, the bowls gleaming with a sheen that suggests both sanctity and menace. The testimony plays over these images, hesitant voices swearing that they saw what they saw, even if no court would believe it. Each account ends the same way, with a pause, a glance over the shoulder, and the same whispered phrase. They pledged themselves to something in that spring. The bowls remain, silent witnesses, blue-stained copper holding its secret like a memory the earth itself refuses to forget. The diary of Dr. Alden Pierce begins with the tone of a rational man who believed the world could be measured in symptoms, treatments, and recovery. He had come to the ridge in 1832, a young physician with steady hands and the conviction that even mountain folk deserved the science of modern medicine. He stayed longer than any outsider before him, and his notes became the only sustained medical record of the Thornwood family during their strange season of change. His early entries are simple observations. He notes that the Thornwood youths approaching their 21st year complained of persistent fatigue, lips tinged with cyanosis, and pulses that slowed to a crawl even when exertion should have driven the heart faster. He describes listening with his stethoscope against their ribs, hearing rhythms so drawn out he feared collapse, yet the patients stood easily, even smiling faintly at his concern. When asked if they felt faint or short of breath, they replied only that they felt stilled, as though their bodies had entered a deeper, quiet, unknown to others. By the winter of 1834, he wrote of an even stranger development. While neighbors froze during storms, the Thornwood youths walked bare-armed through snow, leaving steaming prints in the drifts. Their skin flushed neither red nor pale but carried a faint cast, blue at the fingertips and earlobes. Pierce attempted to treat them with iron, suspecting a deficiency of the blood. The family accepted his prescriptions with courtesy, then returned a week later with their own supply ore hacked directly from the hills behind their homestead. They handed him lumps of cobalt-flecked stone, insisting he grind it fine and mix it into tonics. Pierce admitted in the margin that when he did so, the patient seemed invigorated, though no medical text explained why. In one entry, underlined twice, he describes a girl named Mariah, whose temperature never rose above 92 degrees, yet who moved about with vitality. Her breath fogged even in midsummer, though she denied any chill. When he placed his hand against her wrist, He felt not just a pulse but a subtle vibration, as if something beneath the skin hummed faintly. The later pages grow more troubled. He writes of hearing sounds while visiting their home knocks deep in the floorboards, a metallic rhythm that matched the slowing of his patient's heartbeat. He confesses that he began to dread these visits, though he could not resist the lure of their mystery. His final entry is short, written in an unsteady hand. Something answers below. I treat them, but the hills treat them more. If they are becoming something else, I am witness only, never healer. The Thornwood wedding of January 1837 is recalled less for the vows spoken than for the fire that answered them. Snow had fallen heavy across the ridge, burying fences and bending pines, so that guests arrived muffled in furs, their boots crusted white. The house had been readied with garlands of dried laurel and jars of preserves, and the hearth was stoked high to warm the gathering. Witnesses remembered the bride, Ruth Thornwood, pale and composed, her gown simple, her hair bound with blue ribbons that seemed almost luminous in lamplight. The groom, Elias, stood tall, his hand never straying far from hers. When the vows were spoken, silence fell thicker than the snow outside. The minister's words ended, and as the couple kissed, a roar came from the hearth. For the briefest of moments the flames leapt high and burned not gold but pure cerulean, tongues of fire that cast the entire room in unnatural brilliance. The shadows of the gathered guests lengthened across the walls like specters, and the blaze made every copper bowl on the mantel flash as if freshly polished. The guests gasped, some swearing aloud, others crossing themselves. One swore he saw the groom's breath plume outward in a sapphire mist as he turned from his bride, a cloud so strange that it seemed to shimmer before vanishing into the rafters. It was Temperance Thornwood who acted swiftly. She rose from her chair at the edge of the room and moved with startling speed, taking the nearest taper and snuffing it with bare fingers. Then another, and another, until every candle in the room was dark, leaving only the hearth's eerie blaze. "Hush," she whispered, though whether to the fire, the guests, or the family gathered closest, no one could say. The words spread like command. No one moved. No one spoke again until the flames dimmed back to their ordinary red and the room returned to itself. In the aftermath, the taper she first extinguished was found charred nearly to its base, though the wick had burned only halfway. Preserved in a box of family keepsakes, it remains brittle and black, yet when handled, it stains the fingers with a faint blue dust that lingers even after washing. The archivists labeled it an insert, evidence not of trickery but of transformation, a remnant of fire that answered vows with a color not known to hearth or coal. Guests departed that night in silence, their breath rising pale in the moonlight, each carrying the same memory of a wedding sealed by something older than marriage, a covenant whispered in flame. The Thornwood matriarch, remembered only as Mercy in the family Bible, was said to be the one who put their unspoken rites into writing. She lived through the first turnings and, unlike the others, did not treat them as mystery or affliction, but as covenant. Her words remain on a single scrap of parchment, creased and rubbed thin at the folds, a document preserved more like relic than record. The ink is cramped, her hand small and pressed hard into the fibers, as if each line was etched with the weight of necessity. At the bottom, instead of neat signatures, the family set their thumbprints, each print dusted with a faint powder that even now carries a bluish tinge. Archivists labeled it Exhibit D, but in the house it was called simply the bond. The text begins plainly, though its meaning grows darker with each clause. At the year of 1 and 20, it reads, a vein shall be yielded, and a vein returned. The phrase repeats like refrain, its rhythm more chant than legal language. Family lore explains that the youth approaching turning was expected to give something of themselves to the mountain, whether through blood, breath, or a drop into the spring. In return, the mountain would give back, deepening their strength, binding them closer to its hidden ore. Those who complied thrived, moving with a quiet endurance that outstripped their neighbors, working fields bare-handed in frost, walking miles without fatigue. But the parchment also warns of refusal. Whoso will not yield, it says, shall wander in heat and madness, hearing the hammering underfoot until they are lost. Accounts describe cousins who tried to resist, hoping to remain untouched. Their skin burned with fever, their eyes darted at every sound, and at night they pressed their ears to the floorboards, whispering that they heard strikes, iron on stone, echoing from beneath the earth. None lived long. Some fled into the woods, never to return. Others collapsed in barns or fields, their bodies stiff, their lips stained an unnatural shade. The clause about hammering is repeated 3 times, the last underlined so heavily that the parchment tore beneath the quill. It suggests a punishment less like disease and more like summons, a call from below that could not be ignored. Even those who believed the Thornwoods afflicted with some hereditary condition could not explain how their refusals ended so uniformly, nor why their kin never wept at their burials. The bond ends with a final line, written larger than the rest. The mountain keeps its measure. To touch the parchment is to feel grit at the fingertips, and to hold it long is to find the skin faintly dusted blue, as though the covenant, once read, insists upon its mark. The schoolhouse on Walnut Hill was little more than a one-room cabin, its walls plastered with chalk dust and the smell of damp wood. The teacher's log from the winter of 1855 preserves a single name repeated more often than the rest: Maria Thornwood, age 20, still attending lessons though older than her peers. The entries, written in a steady but uneasy hand, reveal a growing concern that something in the girl was shifting beyond explanation. One note describes how Maria sat in silence long after the lesson ended, her eyes fixed on the iron stove at the front of the room. It had gone cold that morning, the firewood never delivered, but she stared at it as though it breathed. When asked why, she replied in a voice quiet enough that the teacher had to lean close. "I can hear it," she said. "Coal breathing, waiting to be lit." The teacher recorded this carefully, circling the phrase in the margin as though it might need later confirmation. Children whispered that her lips moved when no words were spoken, as if she were repeating what she alone could hear. Another entry marks a small accident. Mariah's slate pencil snapped, and the broken tip cut across her knuckle. The teacher expected the sharp red bead that follows any cut, but what welled instead were 2 drops, perfect and round, with a hue like polished lapis. The color stayed true for several minutes before dulling to gray, and the girl pressed her handkerchief to it without comment. The log notes the handkerchief itself carried a stain that could not be scrubbed away, even after repeated washings. 2 perfect blue ovules, the teacher wrote, as though placed there with a painter's brush. The log returns again and again to her odd requests. She asked to sit by the window no matter the weather, even when the glass rattled with frost and the other students huddled near the stove. Her breath fogged thickly against the panes, and she seemed content to sit with her cheek against the cold, watching the line of the ridge where her family's homestead lay hidden. She says the air is sweeter by the glass, one entry records. I do not understand it, but she insists. By spring the notes grow sparse, the teacher remarking that Mariah's attendance was irregular. Yet each entry that bears her name carries the same tone, uneasy fascination, a hint of dread. The last line written of her before her 21st birthday is simple, underlined once. She listens for what the rest of us cannot hear. The creek ran shallow that spring, its stones bare and slick where the current usually covered them. It was there, among the glint of mica and the smell of wet earth, that a boy named Jacob Weller stooped and pulled from the mud a knife, unlike any his family owned. The blade was copper, dulled and greened with years beneath water, its edge no longer keen but still carrying a weight that felt unnatural in a child's hand. The handle bore markings that he at first mistook for scratches, but when he cleaned it with his shirt sleeve, the pattern resolved into notches, 23 in all, evenly spaced, carved deep into the grip. Jacob carried the knife home and hid it beneath his pillow. That night the dreams began. He told the interviewer, voice small but steady, that he saw colors in his sleep, cobalt rivers winding through black stone, veins that pulsed like they were alive. In one dream, he followed them into a cavern where the walls glowed faintly blue, and a chorus of voices whispered his name from the rock itself. He woke with his nose bleeding, the pillow stained a hue darker than crimson, edged with a tint that shimmered when held against the light. His mother, alarmed, tried to burn the cloth, but even in ash, the stain lingered faintly blue. In the weeks that followed, Jacob's nosebleeds continued. They would not clot red as ordinary wounds do, but trickled long and thin, leaving him pale and shaky. He swore he could hear a sound beneath his feet at night, a hammering that kept pace with his heartbeat, striking stone in rhythm with his breath. "It's under me," he whispered during the interview, shifting uneasily on the porch chair. "It knows I found it." The interviewer pressed him about the knife, asking if he still kept it. Jacob nodded reluctantly and said that when he touched the handle, the notches felt warm, as though holding a memory. He admitted that sometimes he traced them with his finger until he reached the 23rd, and that was when the dreams burned brightest. The session ended abruptly. His mother, having overheard, stepped onto the porch, her face set hard with fear. She placed her hands firmly on her son's shoulders and pulled him inside without a word, the screen door slamming behind her. The recording cuts off there, leaving only the creak of the chair where the boy had sat, and the faint echo of water moving through the creek bed where the copper knife had waited, marked with 23 notches, its purpose still unspoken. The anvil room lay at the farthest end of the Thornwood house, behind a door barred with iron straps and a lock far heavier than any needed for a storeroom. When the crew forced it open, the hinges groaned as though resisting, and a breath of air rolled out colder than the rest of the house, thick with the smell of iron filings and something sweet, almost medicinal. Their lanterns threw pale light across stone walls that had been scraped smooth, and in the center stood the object that gave the room its name. The anvil was small, no taller than a man's knee, but its surface bore marks that unsettled the eye. The dents were not straight blows but crescents, curved impressions that suggested neither blacksmith's hammer nor farm tool. They were shallow yet precise, as though something had pressed into the metal again and again with deliberate patience. Dust lay thick across the floor, but the anvil itself gleamed faintly, as if it had been touched recently. Along one wall stretched a narrow shelf. Upon it rested a line of files, each stoppered with cork and sealed in wax so brittle it cracked when brushed. The labels, written in a careful hand, bore a single word: bluing. The liquid within shifted under the lantern light, appearing at first clear, then flashing a cold blue as the glass tilted. One file had leaked long ago, leaving a stain down the wood that still carried color, as though the years had not dulled it. Against the opposite wall sat a copper basin large enough to bathe a child, its interior coated with beeswax that had cracked in jagged lines. Even in the chill of the room, the basin glistened with a film of moisture. Drops gathered along the rim and trickled down its sides, though no source of water could be found. It was said later that the basin sweated, as though it exhaled in the cold. Crew members pressed their hands to it, and one swore he felt a faint tremor, like the pulse of a living thing. The strangest detail went unnoticed until playback of the audio. While the crew's voices echoed low, cautious, reverent, another sound threaded beneath. A ringing, high and thin, like the afternote of a struck bell. None present recalled hearing it, yet on the recording it rises and falls, steady as breath, filling the spaces between words. It was as though the anvil itself had spoken, its scars not only marks of labor but of invocation, reverberations that lingered in the air long after silence returned. The scene unfolds with a careful stillness, as though everyone in the room knows they are about to cross a threshold. The documentarian sits at a pine table, lantern set close to provide light for the lens. His instruments are plain: a sterilized pin, a square of white cloth, and the quiet resolve to do what others have only whispered about. With a steady hand, he pricks the pad of his finger. A bead swells, red as expected, glistening in the lamplight. He presses it to the cloth, where it spreads into the familiar brown halo of iron-rich blood. The camera lingers, capturing this baseline, this assurance of normality. Then Temperance enters with a boy of her line, his face pale but calm, no sign of fear in his dark eyes. She rests her hand on his shoulder and urges him forward. The boy extends his palm without hesitation, as though the act were ceremony rather than test. The same pin touches his skin, piercing lightly at the fingertip. What wells forth is not the ruddy bloom of health, but something altogether different, a droplet that at first gleams indigo, brighter than any ink, before deepening shade by shade until it settles into the color of twilight sky. The bead clings to the skin, refusing to run, a perfect globe of dusk, caught in miniature. The cloth is brought near, and the droplet finally falls, leaving behind a stain that shimmers even as it dries. The lens strains to capture it, but the image blurs inexplicably. Frames swim out of focus whenever the blood comes into view, as though the camera itself recoils from the hue. Operators adjust settings, wipe the lens, even swap equipment, yet the effect persists. The boy's hand, sharp and clear, becomes ghosted the instant the blue drop gathers. Dr. Silas Cutter, standing in the corner with his satchel of stones and notebooks, mutters his judgment aloud, voice thick with disbelief. Not argyria, he says. Not mineral poisoning. This is not normal. His eyes, wide with awe, follow the slow movement of the indigo drop across the cloth, and he clutches the lapel of his coat as though to steady himself. Temperance only smiles, her breath fogging faintly in the summer air. The mountain keeps its promise, she murmurs, as if to no one in particular. The boy wipes his finger on the hem of his sleeve, leaving a stain that will never wash out, and the room falls into a silence heavy with the knowledge that the legend has bled itself into proof. The disappearance of Maria Thornwood came as both shock and inevitability. 3 nights before her 21st birthday, she slipped from the family homestead without leaving word. Her bed remained neatly made, her shoes missing, a window unlatched, though the air outside had turned sharp with autumn chill. By dawn, the household raised alarm, and before evening the news had reached every farmhouse along the ridge. Sheriff Abram Pike, already uneasy with the family's reputation, took charge of the search himself, determined to treat the matter as he would any runaway, though privately he admitted to fearing this was no ordinary case. Volunteers gathered at the crossroads, lanterns swinging in the dusk, rifles slung more for courage than for need. The sheriff brought hounds from the Miller farm, eager beasts trained on deer and fugitive alike. Yet when he led them toward the ridge path that wound up to Thornwood land, the dogs balked. Hackles rose, teeth bared, and not one could be coaxed beyond the first stand of laurel. They whined and twisted their leashes until the handlers were forced to turn them back, muttering of bad omens. Pike recorded in his notes. Hounds refused the trail, as if some barrier unseen held them fast. The men pressed on without them, their boots crunching leaves, breath clouding in the brittle air. It was Samuel Green, a farmer whose sister had married into the Thornwoods, who found the first trace. On a branch of mountain laurel, snagged like an offering, hung a ribbon of pale fabric, the kind Maria was known to tie in her hair. At first glance it seemed ordinary, until Pike held it to his lantern. The cloth bore a stain at its edge, not red nor brown but blue, a color so vivid it gleamed against the pale weave. He turned it over in his hands, puzzled, and handed it to Deputy Clark. The deputy pressed it to his palm without thought. Hours later he tried to wash the residue away in creek water, then with lye soap, but the stain clung stubbornly, a bluish cast that shimmered under lamplight. By morning his skin looked bruised where the ribbon had touched, though he swore it did not pain him. The others avoided his hand, whispering of contagion. No further trace of Maria appeared. The search combed fields and barns, hollows and caves, but the ridge remained silent. Sheriff Pike filed his report with a single line underlined twice. The girl is gone, and the mountain keeps her. The ribbon, sealed in oilcloth, rests still in the courthouse archive, its edge forever marked by a blue that no water nor time has managed to fade. The night was windless, the ridge held in a silence so complete that every footfall seemed intrusive. The crew gathered by the limestone spring where so many stories had converged, lanterns set carefully along the rocks, their light trembling on the black surface of the pool. The air carried the usual mineral tang, that damp chill that seeped into the bones, but what unsettled them most was the sound their instruments began to pick up as the clock struck midnight. It started faintly, a vibration rather than a noise, the earth itself humming beneath their boots. Then came the rhythm. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 again. Metallic, measured, deliberate, not the random settling of stone or the splash of hidden water, but something that echoed with intention. The recording equipment caught it clearly, each strike reverberating like hammer on anvil, as if the mountain itself were forging something in its heart. The crew exchanged wary glances, their notes hurried, their voices hushed to avoid drowning out the cadence. The knocking persisted, unwavering in tempo, until it seemed to seep into their own pulses. One member pressed an ear to the limestone and swore he could feel the vibrations climbing through his jaw, rattling his teeth. Another whispered that it sounded less like work and more like a summons. The spring responded in kind. With every series of knocks, the water flickered blue, a fleeting shimmer that disappeared as quickly as it came, leaving only the mirrored stillness behind. Then a shift in the lantern light drew their eyes. Temperance Thornwood stood in the doorway of the smokehouse above, her figure framed by the timber beams. She had not been there a moment before, yet now she watched them, motionless, her face pale against the dark. The flames caught in her eyes strangely, not like reflection, but as though glass beads had been set in their place, shining back cold and fixed. The knocking grew louder, closer, until it seemed the ground itself might crack. The crew froze as Temperance lifted her hand, sleeve falling back to reveal fingers faintly smudged with blue. Her voice carried across the spring, low and calm, a lullaby meant for something no one else could see. "Hush now," she whispered, the words chilling in their tenderness. "It's only the work beginning." The camera shuddered as if jolted, then cut abruptly, the frame plunging into black. For several breaths there is only silence, before white letters bloom across the darkness like a verdict. Phase 1 end, the turning approaches.